Okay, here we go.
Hey there, I'm Kelly Filetto, and welcome to the Grit, Guts, and Courage show. This is the show where we talk to people who have overcome some sort of a challenge and they've faced grit, guts, and courage. And today I've got Jonathan King with me, and he's got this incredible story that I just can't wait for you guys to hear. So, hey, Jonathan, how are you?
How's it going, Kelly? How are
I'm
things?
doing great. So great to
Good.
have you here. So, Jonathan, we're just going to jump right into it. So, what is the story that you want to tell of grit, guts, and courage?
I want to tell a story about living in a very non-inclusive environment when I was growing up, and how that shaped my world and my worldview about the need to have more inclusivity. And, I start off in the book talking about being in this perfect little world as a Black boy, where all I saw were just Black people. I was in a Black neighborhood, and I thought that was the way it was supposed to be. I never knew that there was a bigger world than that. I knew there was television, and the people that I saw on that television, they were fictional characters, but in my mind, they were real. All the things I saw were real, but I didn't ever think I would go into that world. And then one day my parents walked into my room and said, Jonathan, you're going to be a part of a big, social experiment. I had no idea what they were talking about. And then a few days later, they took me to this all-white school system, and I was the first Black kid in the town to integrate the school. And I didn't know what to expect, but it was like a roller coaster ride, because all of those kids who were in my class, all of those white kids, did not want me there. And so now that I look back on it, I realized that they were just pawns in this game. That, when kids are born, they're all born with no prejudice. But, by the time they were 5 years old, the parents didn't want this to happen. They didn't want integration. And so I began to get a picture of, oh, this is a non-inclusive world, and this is not what I want. This is not what my parents wanted. So my parents, to me, were the first people, the first inclusive leaders in my life that gave me this ambition to change the world. My white teacher also, I look at now as an inclusive leader, because she took a stance and said, no, we're going to treat Jonathan with respect. I'm going to help him to catch up with you because he's behind academically. And then, after that, when things began to really move, my parents were in partnership with Dr. Martin Luther King in trying to integrate my town. So we actually met him when he came to Albany. He was put in jail along with my parents. And many times my housekeeper didn't even let us know that my parents were in jail. It was just too much for a young mind to even, wrap their heads around. But in the end, going through all of that, that was sort of like the springboard to what I'm doing now. That's what motivated me to try to work on bringing about inclusivity in all aspects of my life, from not just, educational environments, but work environments, and then the community too. In the community spectrum, it's a little harder trying to get people to get on board, because people can do whatever they want. But I try to bring this about in the trainings that I do and with the people that I meet, that, you may not like the person that you're looking at, but if we're going to live in a more united world, we have to become more open to inclusivity. So what the book is all about that I'm writing is, if you want to become inclusive, there are 5 steps. There are 5 simple steps. Now, the steps are simple, but the process is hard. That's what I tell people. That this is not, the steps can be conceptualized and understood, but the process is, I would call it a lifelong process, because culture is so wide and so deep that you can never really wrap your head around it. So the approach is, you have to go in humbly, you have to go in with some vulnerability. And if you do that, you can become really, I think, experienced and knowledgeable as an inclusive leader as time goes on.
I love your story, Jonathan, and I want to back you up a bit, because I know your story, and I remember you telling me the story about your father being in jail and your mom having to go and bring some food to him. Can you tell that story, please?
I sure can. So, this was around the time that the city kind of like was in lockdown because, my parents said, hey, enough is enough. I want my kid to have, or their kids to have the same as white kids. And so they began to protest. And then they got the college students involved and the high school students involved. And so all hell broke loose. So around that time, our housekeeper, her name was Ella Mae. The housekeeper's daughter, I'm sorry, was Ella Mae. So Ella Mae was thrown in jail as well. And they were thrown in jail in a city which is about 30 miles away called Camilla. And so my father and Martin Luther King and Ella Mae were in the same jail. So my mother decided, because the conditions were so horrible in that jail. I mean, the food was, 3-4 days old. They had weevils in the food, and it was horrible. I mean, the living conditions, many of them slept on the concrete floor. So my mother decided to take blankets down there and also food. So we packed the food up. We got the blankets. She didn't really explain to us as kids what was going on because I was 5, my sister was 3, and my brother was 1. And then she was pregnant. And then Mrs. Young was a housekeeper, and her baby girl was there in the jail. So Miss Young went with us down there. So we were kind of like in a playful mood. We were happy. We were going to see Ella Mae. And so we get to the actual jail, which is in Camilla. We see this massive jail, and we see people kind of walking around, and we're trying to figure out, well, we know that Ella Mae is here, but where's Ella Mae? And then we were walking in the back of the jail, and we saw the hand coming out of the jail cell, and we saw Ella Mae, and we were all excited. We were jumping out, oh, that's Ella Mae, that's Ella Mae. And then my mother was trying to find a way to get the blankets and the food to Ella Mae, to my father. And all of a sudden we heard this kind of pushing and shoving and screaming and barking to get out of the way, get out of the way. And these 2 big cops were coming toward us. And we didn't know what to think, right? Because you're a child, and everything that you know about cops is about security and protection and safety and that kind of thing. So we had no idea what was about to happen. So out of nowhere, this big cop approaches my mother, and he says, you're not moving fast enough. And then he shoved her to the ground, and she's a pregnant woman, and all hell broke loose. As kids, we saw our mother just topple to the ground, and another officer came around and kicked her in the stomach. And at that moment, she blanked out. She was unconscious, knocked out. And we were just screaming and hollering. And it's interesting how your mind works, because I right now I can't even remember what happened after that. I can't remember being taken to the car. I can't remember, what happened to my mom. But I was told that my mom was all scraped up and bloody, and that she got up after, I guess, a few minutes, and then she walked us to the car and drove us back home. Long story short, it was that when we got back home that night, what I was told was that my father, that was the first time that we actually saw him cry, because he felt like he should have been there to protect my mom. And the news just began to spiral around, like, what's going to happen? And so they tried to solicit the support of the federal government, but they didn't want to get involved. So speed up 4 months later, we went to the hospital because my mother was supposed to deliver the child. And so my father put me in the back seat. We drove to the hospital, and then we just sat there and waited for her to come out. And it felt like everything was in slow motion. When she came to the glass door, they opened the door, and then they brought her out on a wheelchair. And I, like a hawk, was just looking for the baby, because I was so excited about this little new sibling that was going to be my little brother. And so they brought her down to the car. They opened the door. They gently, picked her up out of the wheelchair, and they put her in the car and shut the door. And little Jonathan was like, where is the baby? Mommy, where's the baby? And I just kept asking that question. And so we started, going down the road, and it was total silence. She never turned around. She never said anything about the baby. My father never said anything about the baby. And we get to the house, nothing was said about the baby, ever. Just imagine this. We never talked about the death of that baby. I think it was so traumatic for my mom that she could never talk about it. My father could never talk about it. So, interestingly enough, years later, when I had to give a talk about civil rights history in the making, and I was working on the talk, and my mind went back to that, and I said, that didn't happen. That couldn't have happened. That probably was me as a kid making things up. And then when I finally realized that it did happen, I was just blown away. Like, this really was a part of history. This is something that happened. And a few days later, Dr. Martin Luther King actually gave a press conference in our backyard to talk about what had happened and the sacrifice that my mother had made. And he actually did something that was interesting, because when my mother was beat up that day and the word got back to Albany, the Blacks start rioting in the city. And it was a big embarrassment for Dr. King, because it was supposed to be a nonviolent movement. So that particular day, he said, we need to have a day of penance for what happened, because this is supposed to be a non-violent, community. We're not supposed to react. And so for the next 2 or 3 days, Dr. King and my father and others, they went all throughout the community. They went to the pool halls, to the stores, the restaurants, and talked about the importance of nonviolence in the city. So
Wow, what an
that's
incredible
just a little
story.
clip. I mean, I was there, I'm kind of still pinching myself, because imagine me being a little kid tagging along, being with Dr. Martin Luther King, going from place to place as this so-called prophet of peace talked about the need to not fight back after this happened to my mom.
That's such an incredible story. And, I've heard this story a few times now, and every time I hear it, it just impacts me in such a huge way.
Well,
And
I never get
so,
tired of telling that story, because I was there. I saw it with my own eyes. And I don't have any hate toward those policemen, because it really was not their fault to a certain degree, because they were menaced by their own prejudices. And when you're raised at a very young age, when you're brainwashed like that, it's almost like, what happened to Germany. All of those little kids, right? They were brainwashed by their own government. And that's why all those negative things in Germany happened, because people believed so strongly in what they were taught, and they had no way of getting out of that. So that's why I'm always thinking, what if we can get to the children and prevent them from having that kind of implicit bias towards other people of different races and ethnicities?
so how did you get through it all?
Oh boy. Part of it was just having a deeper understanding about human nature, being able to travel and see how implicit bias works. Living in Japan was one of the highlights of my life, to see that all of these people in Japan and in Asia, they think a certain way because of the way they're taught. But it doesn't mean that people are stuck in their thinking. It just means that the younger you are and the longer you kind of embrace those thoughts, the harder it's going to be to get out of this implicit bias. So I've just been able to take a spiritual attitude toward people in general, knowing that people are innocent, but in the end, if they are brainwashed by their parents, they have hell to pay. They really do.
Okay. So what's the gift in you going through all of this?
So what again? I'm sorry.
What's the gift in it? What's the gift in you having to go through all of the challenges that you have?
The gift for me was understanding that there are choices that people can make, right? People can hold on to their anger about something, or they can look at the bigger picture and say, what can I do to get out of this? So, Dr. King, for example, was a person I looked up to. He went through a lot of challenges. He suffered the ultimate sacrifice when he had to give up his life. But I look at it like we're all able to be change agents. And I'm standing on the shoulders of my parents, I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Dr. King. And my whole thing is my gift and my I would say insight is to try to bring about unity amongst people of different backgrounds and do that in the workplace.
So tell us a little bit more about what you do, because I know you do some incredible work, and share with us what you do.
Okay, so I've been working in all of these different organizations from the time I was 18 years old. And by me being most times the only one of color, I've been able to see all of the different ways that people have tried to sometimes keep diverse populations marginalized in those particular work environments. And what I try to do now is make people aware of how to be more inclusive, because most people refrain from doing that. They want to take the easy way out. And the easy way out is just associating with the people that you look like and the people that, you have some kind of cultural affinity with. But after going through all of these different experiences, I put together a program. And this program is aimed at helping people to acknowledge that they have implicit bias. And that's very difficult, Kelly, for some people, because they don't want to admit it and they don't want to be exposed and they think it's a bad thing. The second thing is, how do you actually diffuse your bias? How do you confront the bias? And then in looking at this 5-step plan, the next thing is, well, once you diffuse the bias, what's next? And that is being able to align yourself with people that look different from you. And that's another hard step.
Right.
To consciously align yourself. And when I say align, I mean, what are we going to do to get to know that culture better? Because most times people just associate with others who look like them. And so I put in steps on how that's done. So there are 5 steps. The first is A stands for acknowledge, and then D stands for disrupt, okay? And then A stands for align, and then the next step is participate in party, which means, okay, now we're going to actually figure out a way to collaborate together in a very conscious way. And then the last one is T, and that's for take down and tackle any kind of form of systemic racism that is in the organization. So it's a step-by-step process.
And people can read more about that in your book.
Yes, for sure, for sure.
That's what I love about the book, that we're working together on to get published and make it into a bestseller. And you go more into depth of those 5 steps.
Yeah, and some people think it's namby-pamby. But I think the critical piece right here, Kelly, is that if you take something like a implicit bias assessment, it can hone in on what those issues might be, right? But the key here is understanding that everyone has it. There is no one free from this particular, I don't want to call it a problem, but it is something that's attached to how we're raised. Everybody is kind of clued in with it.
Okay, so what are some words of wisdom that you'd like to share with the audience?
Words of wisdom, I would say, is don't be hard on yourself. When it comes to trying to be inclusive, just don't be hard on yourself. Don't look at yourself as having to be perfect. Know that this is a marathon and it's not a sprint. It could take some people years. It could take a year. For some people, it could take 6 months. But the first step is just realizing that you acknowledge that you have implicit bias. And also, this particular exercise is not only for whites. Some people think, oh, it's whites who need this. No, everybody needs it. and I give the example of my wife, who is from Kenya, Africa. And she told me that in her country, there are 30 different tribes. Because I was just thinking, okay, you know what? you know, I'm an African American and they're all African and we all have the same kind of interest in things. No, that's not the way it is. So in her country, she told me that there are 30 different tribes. And I said, well, what do you think about each other? And she says, oh, we all hate each other. So I said, you guys need the book too, right?
Oh my God, that is so
So,
funny. So,
but
so Jonathan,
you
I
know,
know you got to get going. So how can people get in touch with you?
okay, they can actually go to my website, which is jkingconsulting.com. And there they can find out more about what I do. They can find out more about the book and what's in the book. And then if they want services, they can actually reach out to me through that website.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Thank you for taking the time, Kelly. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and your audience.
You are very, very welcome. Thank you. Okay, guys.
Okay.
So that was Jonathan King. And, stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you.